All right, good afternoon. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the NADEX Exporting to the EU, Navigating the Three Major Stumbling Blocks webinar. My name is Jonathan Such. I am actually the chair of the NADEC, and I want to welcome you to this program. I think we have an excellent program slated for you here this afternoon. I look forward to hearing from our speakers and actually hearing from you, the attendees, in our Q&A session. So without further ado, I want to get started by introducing a couple people, and then I'm going to turn it over to one of those people to go ahead and introduce the last two panelists. So I'm going to start with Susanna Hardy, who serves as the Chief Content Officer at IBT Online, and as such is involved in all aspects of content used in effective business online tools, from website content creation to optimization for online marketing. Susanna works closely with the website build and online marketing teams at IBT Online to help companies reach, develop, and succeed in their exports. And I'm going to add to Susanna's bio there for a minute in that I personally have worked with Susanna on my own websites. For those of you that don't know, I own my own company and I manufacture grinding wheels and export to 28 countries around the world. And Susanna and her team were so gracious in working with me, because I'm not the easiest person to work with, because as a longtime exporter, sometimes we think we know our products better than most, but she has been excellent, her and her team. Not only was she very involved from the beginning to the end of the website builds, but even post website build in making sure we were getting what we needed. So, for those of you that are looking at building international websites, I can tell you, Susanna and her team are amazing. She really handheld me through most of the steps, especially with keyword searches and stuff like that. So excellent team there at IBT Online. And Susanna really accentuates that because she really does care about your product. So, while her bio talks a lot about what she does, she learns the culture of your company, learns you as a company as a whole, and integrates that into the website. So if you're looking for a website that can really showcase your company, your culture, Susanna and her team are second to none in my book. And I've worked with other website developers, but Susanna, kudos to you and your team at IBT Online. You've done an amazing job. And our next person is my co-moderator, my longtime friend, Rick Grana, who's the president of Impex. He's the chair of the Kentucky District Export Council. He's a member of ITAC 9. He's a member of the NADEC Advisory Board. He's been a mentor to me and many others. But in reality, what is Rick Grana the person? Rick Grana the person is the man who fights for SMEs on all fronts. Rick is very humble in what he does, but in all honesty, Rick normally travels the world to SME workshops, and he asks SMEs, not only through his own company Impex, what he needs, but what do others need that maybe he's not privy to. So if there's information with logistics or with packaging or things like that, Rick is very open to hearing SMEs cries for help or opportunities, and then he takes that around the world to these SME workshops, whether they're domestically in the US or internationally. So Rick really, not only in those settings, but also in places like Washington, DC, the legislative halls of Kentucky, really has been a huge advocate for SMEs. So, Rick should be very, I guess, I wouldn't call it champion, but I would say he'd be applauded for everything that he's done, because he's been a great champion of SMEs. So I'm going to turn it over to Rick, who's going to go ahead and introduce our next two panelists. So Rick, if you could, sir, please take it away from me.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. And I also want to thank everybody for coming on today. It's very important that everybody gets a good, has a good time actually looking at what we're doing and what it might bring them to help with some of their other problems. And that's why we're here. We're here to help everybody. Thank you, Jonathan, so much for that introduction. But I'd like to go ahead and start with another introduction. This is for Yvonne Helpus. She's the founder and senior partner of the QNet. It's a CE marking consulting firm in QNet BV, the Netherlands. I believe she's from the Netherlands, but I haven't actually asked her. But anyway, she has a lot of information about the EU, and she's an EU authorized representative firm, and she focuses on medical devices, machinery, personal protective equipment, and in vitro diagnostic services. By the way, in 1985, she was awarded the World Trader of the Year Award by the state of Minnesota. And in 2016, QNet was awarded the Presidential E Award for export services. She is a member of the Minnesota District Export Council since 2011 and serves on the Minnesota DEC Legislation, Education, and Outreach Committee. Thank you, Yvonne, for being here as well. My next introduction will be with Mark Wingate. Mark is a fourth-generation entrepreneur, and he's responsible for founding 5 corporations, 2 of which he is still involved with. He's a senior member of the IEEE and has participated at all levels of standards, regionally, nationally, and internationally, including conformity assessment. Now, Mark's been involved in small business government relations for over a decade and as an advocate and advisor to the United States on international trade. By the way, he's also on the ITAC 9 committee. So there's 3 of us on the ITAC 9 committee, and whatever remarks that we do today are not indicative of the committee. We're doing this as our company. He also serves on many boards of corporations, universities, and small business support enterprises. Thank you, Mark, for helping us today on being a panelist. So I guess, who's going to go first, Jonathan? Are we going to have Yvonne, I guess, go first?
Yes, Yvonne's going to go first.
Okay.
So Yvonne, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. I want to give you a quick overview of European standards and conformity assessments. Next slide, please. When you want to place a product, a machine, a medical device that's manufactured in the EU or the USA, and that you want to place on the EU market, you have to make sure that it complies with the essential health and safety requirements that are outlined in the EU directives and regulations that are published in the EU official journal. It's estimated that about 50 to 75% of all products require this process. And it doesn't matter how you place these, the method you use to place these products on the market, whether it's through a distributor, whether it's client direct, or whether it's e-commerce like through Amazon, which the Europeans call long distance selling. Next slide, please. During this compliance process, you are also required to use the EU standards. They are harmonized with the essential health and safety requirements in each directive and or regulations, and are used throughout the compliance process. They want you to use EU standards simply because it gives you presumption of compliance, is what it's called. If you would happen to have a product that you manufacture that does not fall under a directive or regulations, and it's, for example, a consumer product, then you need to comply with the General Product Safety Directive. If that doesn't address EU products, then you're back to complying with each and every country's individual requirements. Next, please. As you start the process of complying with these essential health and safety requirements, which is commonly referred to as compiling a technical file, one of the first requirements will be a hazard and risk assessment that you need to perform in accordance with the EU harmonized standards. And this particular hazard and risk assessment focuses on the safety and health of the operator or user. It does not focus, as we do in the United States, on the potential breakdown of the product. One of these essential health and safety requirements addresses very specific labeling requirements. also referred to in these directives as marking requirements. This is very important to observe because mislabeling is the #1 reason for product recalls from the EU market. It's the #1 reason that customs uses not to allow your products to enter the EU. So writing these labels is not always easy. People tend to want to put advertising sentences on these labels, and I strongly recommend you don't, because remember, everything you put on these labels must be translated. Or a preferred method is that you use European symbols, also published in standards. For the manuals and you must send a manual with most products, a user manual, an installation manual, a servicing manual, whatever is required for your products. We strongly recommend you use as little text as you can, simply because it will save you a lot of dollars on translations. So we recommend that you use pictures, drawings, photos, whatever will cut out as much text as you can, because that will save a lot of money. So no advertising material on the labels, please. Next slide, please. There's often a lot of miscommunication because people don't all speak American English. And these directives and regulations certainly are not written in American English. Okay, so there are often misunderstandings about what certain words means. For example, let's take the machinery directive as an example. It defines who the manufacturer is, and it states it's the party that places its name and or trademark on the plate or the label and is thereby taking responsibility for the design, through production, and the compliance with all applicable directives and regulations. When I teach these seminars about the machinery directive, I see a whole lot of reactions on people's faces in front of me, because many people don't even have a production facility, but they are taking somebody else's product and they take the labels off and they put their own labels on, not realizing they're taking on full responsibility and liability. And now all of a sudden they're called the manufacturer. And that for some people is a bit of a rude awakening. On top of that, in these new regulations, because all the directives are now being changed over to regulations, they have very specific outlines of the general obligations of the manufacturer, the importer, the distributor, and the authorized representative for regulatory affairs that you need to appoint in the EU. You may want to look at that, and especially also take that into consideration when you're writing distributor agreements. The second definition, also from the machinery directive, for example, is the operator. We all know what an operator is, but in this case, I believe it's a bit expanded. The operator is the person or persons installing, operating, adjusting, maintaining, cleaning, repairing, or moving the machinery. So everyone who interacts with that piece of machinery is considered the operator. And that's a bit different than what we consider an operator in the United States. Next slide, please. A question I most often get is, I want to self-certify my product. We have chosen that process. Well, no, that's not a matter of choice. It's a matter of what the directive or regulations tell you you can do. If it allows your product to be self-certified, that means that you have to follow the self-certification process. And when that's completed, a manufacturer can issue a declaration of conformity. If your product falls under an assessment process by a European assessment agency called a notified body, that means that they have to come on site and they have to assess and certify your quality management system, your technical file, and they come 1 or 2 people and stay for several days. And if everything is 100% okay, then they will issue an EC type certificate. And only then may the manufacturer issue a declaration of conformity. That declaration of conformity is the one document that everyone can ask for. If somebody tells you that their product is in complete conformity, European conformity, with the applicable regulations and the use of these standards, then you are supposed to hand it over to them. And that declaration must be very specific. It must show who the manufacturer is. It must show which regulation you, the manufacturer, are claiming compliance with. You have to give a list of the EU standards that were used in this process. And then it must be dated, signed, and the title of the person that's assigned this responsibility liability. And the way it's phrased this way is because what they're looking for is they want a corporate officer. In other words, somebody that can commit the company legally and financially to sign this document. Next slide, please. This process is commonly referred to as CE marking. And CE stands for Conformity European, or EC is European conformity. And it's totally based on European directives or regulations, and it includes use of European standards. Thank you for listening, and any questions you may have, I'll be happy to answer.
And for everybody, please put any questions that you have in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to those as soon as possible. And Yvonne, I just want to touch on the CE marking. As a manufacturer that is CE certified and has CE marking, you know, we hear stories about how sometimes, and Mark, please jump in as well, how sometimes the CE marking is treated differently in different countries, where, you know, certain Western European countries may, like Germany, France, Italy, may treat CE markings one way, where maybe more Eastern European countries such as Poland or Central European like Hungary and Romania may actually have a different view of CE and the regulations there. So would either one of you like to just touch base on that before we move to Susanna?
Well, I've heard this quite often, but there is a document called the Blue Guide. And each country that has committed to be part of the EU must follow this as the law. So the Blue Guide has been published with all the legal definitions and arguments that you can use to argue those misinterpretations. It's for your protection, and I strongly recommend that you get a hold of the Blue Guide.
Well, thank you very much. That's great information. So again, CE marking is very important. Go ahead, Rick.
Yeah. Did you want to talk about, Yvonne, about the medical device certification and how much that you've noticed that it's cost in the past?
The new medical device regulation that's in effect now has been extended again for the higher risk classifications. The compliance dates are now 2027 and 2028, because what they discovered was that they had insufficient certification agencies and insufficient auditors for those agencies. And that's been a big problem. As a result, lots of people have lost their certification. And to no surprise to all of us, this has created a fee structure that's prohibitive for most SMEs. And I'm talking about fees such as $100,000 for a small manufacturer is just not doable. With the result that about 15,000 products have been taken off the EU market for people saying, no, thank you, I'm not paying this entry fee. And it repeats every 5 years. So it's not forever, like you pay one fee with the FDA, it repeats every 5 years. And so it has become a real difficult situation. In Minnesota, we're writing a white paper on this, and I hope we can share it with all of you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to say that in the Q&A box, Mark has mentioned that in the Chicago area, they use the UL Underwriters Labs to help assist them in gaining their CE mark, which, you know, Underwriters Lab and CE are different in certain ways, everybody, but you can do that. I will add that as a manufacturer that has UL listed equipment and CE equipment, it's important that if you have both, foreign countries outside of the EU and US, you need to find out which certifications they accept. There are countries around the world outside of the EU that accept CE, and there are some that accept UL. And Yvonne, I see you would like to add to that.
There is a difference between testing and certification. It's often confusing for people. UL is a testing laboratory, but they also have a notified body office in the UK. All right. So, but UL is focused on testing in accordance with standards. Some of those standards are actually the equivalent of the European standards, but there are very few. Okay, but there's a difference between testing and certification. So the testing that's being done by the UL may be acceptable for EU certification or not. That depends on, UL can tell you whether this is equivalent of a European standard or not.
So thank you, Mark, for that. And since we're talking about being in compliance and everything, I think Susanna is going to talk to us about the, I would say, the pros of having your website and your digital media in compliance with European regulations, as opposed to your competitors that may not have a clue. So that, you know, this is a great webinar for you to hear about these compliance regulations and everything, and to reach out to us and to IBT afterwards to make sure that you're in compliance. Because again, I think Susanna's going to touch on the actual, you know, leg up that you're going to have. You know, you're going to be ahead of your competitors by being in compliance to these new EU regulations, because I think we're seeing other countries around the world follow on this. And Susanna, if you could please take it from there and really talk to us about the opportunities companies have.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And I'm delighted to be here today. Good afternoon, everybody, my fellow panelists and all the participants. It's great to be here today. And I was really struck when I was asked to participate in today's webinar and talking about the three major stumbling blocks. I mean, three? Who's the three? Only three? But anyway, as Jonathan said, I'm hoping I can also convince you all that GDPR is and online compliance is not necessarily a stumbling block. It could actually be an advantage to you. Let's see how we go on. Let's see if I convince you on that. So just a quick word on IBT Online, and this is not really to plug us so much as just to say we are 100% focused on online tools. That's all we do. We do websites, online marketing. That's all we do. So, and we're a private company. So, and what we say, by the way, is our personal opinion. And we're on, I just want to sort of emphasize, we're on your side. We're on the exporter's side. And we also run a whole bunch of what are called online global programs. I wanted really to emphasize this map of the USA. The yellow ones are all the states where we have online global programs, where, you know, the states have said, yeah, this is actually important for our companies. 5 years ago, there were like 5 states, 6. So this is really something that's moving into acknowledgement that companies need effective online business development tools to grow internationally as well as domestically. And with that, I want to talk about GDPR and the data protection regulation in the EU, and is it a stumbling block, or in fact, can you turn it into an opportunity? Can you say, in fact, maybe I could turn this into my advantage? Is it a huge stumbling block, or is it something that I can manage? Is it something that's dissuading millions of companies, or in fact, is it a big scary thing in the cupboard? Let's see where we go. First, I wanted just to mention that there's I know you're never supposed to do slide decks with lots of stats. I promise there's not too many, but the next couple are. I just want to highlight one thing. We're now 8 billion people on this blessed planet. It's an awful lot, isn't it? 5 billion are online. So 5 out of 8 billion people. 4.5 of them are on social media. So 5 billion out of 8 billion, remember that. And those 5 billion are spending nearly 7 hours a day on the internet. So 5 billion, 7 hours a day, of which about 2.5 on social media. So this is, this is big stuff. And I think for SMEs, you should take this as good news. This is good news. You know where your leads are internationally. You know where your current clients are, your employees, your distributors. They're online, and you know how to reach them. There's one platform that's getting to them, but it might not be the one that you choose, but there is one that they're using. Everybody's using some kind of platform. Everybody's using the internet. So the first takeaway from my slide side is make sure that your companies, make sure that you have websites and online marketing strategies that are fit for purpose, that are fit for 2023. It's no longer a nice to have. It really is something, as what I always say to also clients is, bring your website into your sales and marketing discussions, bring it into the weekly meeting, just bring it in and say, what are we doing on our website? What are we doing on our marketing here? And so on. So with that, the importance then of compliance. And I want to show compliance is an interesting thing on the internet. The internet is actually very recent. Okay, there was some startings in late 1960s. In 1989, Tim Berners-Lee invents the World Wide Web. By the year 2000, there's 300 million people, basically all the scientists in the world are online. Facebook is launched 19 years ago. 19 years ago. There are 3 billion people logging on to Facebook every month in 2023. 19 years ago, they're launched. What happened, the real impetus, and why I've got one of my heroes, Steve Jobs, up there in 2007, was the launch of the smartphone. And that just really accelerated. And you suddenly went from 1 to 5 billion on the internet. And now the internet smartphone is the worldwide business tool. And if I look at the next slide, I wanted to put this into a sort of schematic. This is very, very sort of big picture stuff, but just to say, up until, in the beginnings, up until sort of mid 2010, 2015, there were 3 big silos. And the internet really felt like a Wild West. There was very little regulation, but you still had these 3 worldviews of what the internet should be. On the far right stage, you had countries like China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Yemen, other places like that, who basically said, the internet belongs to the government. People's data, your data, belongs to me, the government. I own and control your data. Anything you put online is for me to look at, investigate, deal with. That's sort of China, Russia. So data belongs to the government. Then there's on the far left, we've got the USA, we've got parts of Asia, we've got Canada, Australia, a lot of Latin America, who basically says the internet's about money. So, it's the service providers. They own the internet, they own the data. So Google makes the money out of it. They own your data. Facebook makes the money. So you think, oh, I'm going onto Google because it's free to search. No, nothing's free. If it's free on the internet, you are the price. So, and on the far left, you've got basically the big corporations, and the data, it belongs to corporations. In the middle, you have the EU, who started out saying data belongs to an individual. And that basically sets the scene, as it were, just very schematically. And up until about sort of 2014 or so, you had sort of a flurry of just endless things coming out of the EU, which were really hard to just, it was like one after the other, year after year of regulations and different harmonizations. First that was cookies and Impressum, and then there was the EU data protection, and then Privacy Shield, that was between the EU and the US, just trying to make things harmonized, but it became a massive mess. And so the EU got together and said, we can't stand this anymore. Every state within 28 member states has different regulations for the for internet. We can't deal with this. So very much, I think, in contrast to Yvonne, where things have grown sort of like a hydra. In fact, on the internet, it's almost the opposite. We started out like this, and there's a cap we put on it with the GDPR. GDPR was thought about in 2014, voted and approved in 2016, implemented in 2018. Now let's have a look at what is the GDPR. There are basically 4 main objectives. And it's basically control, rights, sanctions, and applicability. Those are the 4 big parts of the EU objective. It was all about saying EU citizens are the owners of their data and therefore must be able to control their data. So you have to have rights over those data. If you have rights but there are no sanctions, then it's empty. So there has to be sanctions of non-compliance. And who does it apply to? It has to be very clear where it applies to. So those are the 4 big sort of areas where you see this regulation coming through. And now there are 4 big digital citizen rights that I said. Ooh, you're going the other way. Sorry. There we go. So EU digital citizen rights. What are the rights of a citizen? They're actually about sort of 7, but they really group into these 4 big categories. A citizen has the right to bring its data from one channel, like Facebook, to another channel. It has its right to be forgotten, to say, you, Instagram, wipe me off everything. It has the right to view its data. You, Social Security person, I want to know exactly what you know about me. Tell me. And it has the right to make changes on that data. So those are the 4 big rights of any EU enshrined within the GDPR. Okay, does this apply to US companies? Absolutely. Absolutely it does. GDPR is not about EU citizens within the EU. Its applicability is worldwide. So if you are a US company that has European employees, or that sells into Europe, or that has a distributor in Europe, or whatever, it applies to you. And I'm going to get back to this later on when I talk about how it's sort of spreading out a bit, but let's go on and see what a little bit more detail. The first big point to make about GDPR is that there's 2 aspects to it. There's processing data and then there's personal data. Processing data is, what are you doing with the data? Are you collecting it? Are you storing it? Are you sharing it? Are you transferring it from your European distributor to your US? Are you using, are you transferring it to a logistics partner? What are you doing with that data? And the other point is the personal data itself. What is personal data? Personal data is absolutely what it says on the tin. It's the name, the person's address, their gender, any financial information, any health information. And financial and health are the 2 big ones. What is not personal data? Info at, welcome at. Remember also any company information. GDPR does not apply to companies. It applies to individuals. It applies to me, Susanna. It doesn't apply to IBT Online. So in your finance departments, in your sales accounts, you could perfectly well have all the data you want on us as a company, but you might be restricted to know some of my data, my personal data. I'm totally happy about it. The other point about GDPR is that there's 2, just as Yvonne was saying, there's a manufacturer and there's an operator. In GDPR, there's a controller and a processor, and think of them as the manufacturer and the operator. Manufacturer is the controller. They control the data. They are the company like ASI, who make the things, who then have the clients, who have the logistic partners, and so on. The processor are the logistic partners, the finance department, the online marketing company, the service providers for that export. The processor, they need to help and support and be in compliance with the controller. The controller needs to be in compliance with GDPR. In order for the controller to make sure that the processor is in charge of GDPR, you just send them a standard piece of paper that says, are you in compliance with GDPR? If they answer yes, that's all your duty done. End of story. The rest is their liability. Let's take an example. So ABC Company Inc. They're a US company, they export to Europe. Let's call them a B2B, mid-sized. Let's say they sell, the route to market is via distributors. They have several different European websites. They do some online marketing, they do some social media, they go to trade shows. They have logistic partners, they have CRMs, they have Salesforce, they have other things like that. They have accounting partners. So they have various service providers. Let's see where would they fit? What would they do? The first, there's sort of like, I've listed this sort of like 8 steps to go, what to do to be GDPR compliant. The first is appoint someone who's going to do this in-house. Appoint a directly responsible individual, DRI. Most of you only need DRIs. You don't need a data protection officer. If you are an online marketing company or if you're Facebook, you definitely need a data protection officer. But if not, if you are a B2B exporting to Europe, whatever, you need a directly responsible individual. It can't be the intern who's coming for the summer. I would put someone like maybe in the finance department, for example. This person doesn't have personal responsibility, but it's their job to know what the rules are and to know the basics of what to do. Then you need to determine and figure out, define your role as a company. Are you a controller or a processor? And therefore, what are your responsibilities within those things? And then the third part is tell your staff. Tell your sales force, tell your sales guys, tell your marketeers, tell your finance guys, hey, we're going to be GDPR compliant. We're getting on this. We're going to do this. The fourth part is the hardest part, and it's mapping data flows. Data has a habit of getting in everywhere, into sales, into logistics, into everywhere. And the sales guy is out in the car in his trade show all the time. All he wants to do is an Excel spreadsheet. The finance people, they're working on Salesforce. It gets all over the place. But you need to know where your data is and how to map it properly. And the big part is, don't buy in databases which are non-compliant. That's the big takeaway about this. But some takeaways as well. Remember, how is your data being stored? Is it carefully done, or is it just sloppy? On the next slide, then, some of the next steps: inform the processors, like your distributors, your logistic partners, and so on. So ask them if they are GDPR compliant. If not, could they get that? Then, draft your procedures, and in particular, data breach. I'll get back to this in a second. And then put up a little calendar and say, right, we got to review this once a year. Once a year, we got to look at this and make sure we're at it. And the 8th step, I said, applaud yourself. Put it out there. We are GDPR compliant. We've gone through this. We are GDPR compliant. And that is good news. That is good news for you as a company. It is good news for you as versus your competitors. And it means you've done your housekeeping internally. Because data privacy and GDPR is all about putting privacy and data protection at the core. There are lots of ways that our companies get around GDPR. It's not as though you can't do online marketing anymore with GDPR. All you need to do is make sure that people have explicit opt-ins. Before you can download that piece of information on my website, you have to tick that box, and the box has to be very explicit. And remember that building those trust and relationships and that feeling of, okay, we are careful with your data, we respect your data, we have invested in this. That builds the trust that you need in that buyer's journey to succeed. So just sort of second takeaway and is just, I've said data breach, what happens? Data breach is the big acid test. If your company, remember those numbers in the beginning, 8 billion people on the planet, 5 billion on the internet, 7 hours a day. Your company will have a data breach. It will happen. So just, make sure you know what to do. And the best test of whether you're really GDPR compliant or not is whether you can deal with a data breach. My simple takeaway, get a normal piece of paper, write down the person who's directly responsible for all this, put their telephone number, stick it next to the coffee machine, and say, it's a data breach. Phone them right away. Say, right, what is our procedure on this? What do we do? Which servers do we turn off? How do we start? Who do we call? The good news is as well, any one of the EU data protection commissions will respond to you immediately and have that duty within 72 hours. My personal favorite is the Irish one because they speak English. So, that's the Data Protection Commission. Wow. Very helpful, very nice. There's an English one too, but they're a little bit out because of Brexit. On the next slide, I just wanted to put a couple of things that are coming our way. Data protection is moving like a wave, and AI is in fact accelerating that as well. Google is moving towards that with GA4, which is coming in May, is it June 2023. You can see, and from a previous slide, the number of companies moving towards GDPR, whether that's Canada, Japan, Colombia, India. This is something that's not stopping. It's moving towards increased privacy. And that, I think, with AI will increase. So I've given you a whirlwind tour. Please let me know if there are any questions or any way if I can help. Thank you very much.
Susanna, we have a couple questions real quick on the US-EU GDPR agreement. You had mid-2023. Are there any further updates? We know that President Obama signed a executive order October 7th, basically working the US towards this US-EU GDPR agreement. But are there any updates on your side as to anything else that's come about since October?
Well, I think people are watching California very much because that's could basically come in, which uses a sort of, it looks like sort of anti-spam law, which is similar to what you have in Canada, but in fact, it's dressed up as it's very, very similar to GDPR. And I think you'll find that I know there's a working party as well with something called the ICO, which we've asked to submit something to, and I think that you will hear something pretty soon about it.
And here's another quick question. It's actually a very pertinent question to a lot of us that have CRMs. This question is, I have a data storage question. As a small business, I have a CRM. My US website collects data of EU clients who sign up for my newsletter. Where do I need to store this data for my European clients, in the US or in the EU?
You can store it in the US. Ideally in Europe, you can store it in the US as long as your CRM provider has given you an agreement. One of the things about these controller processor agreements is that it tends to make advantage for the bigger players, because you can bet that HubSpot, Marketo, Salesforce, they're all totally on board with GDPR. If you contact them and say, hey, do you have GDPR compliant? They will, within half an hour, you'll get their agreement on it. So there shouldn't be any problem in that. But ideally, if possible, if you could store it in the EU, but if you are GDPR compliant, then you can transfer data. If you're not GDPR compliant, then you must not transfer that data outside the EU.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think that's very helpful for everybody. And please, everybody, just continue to put your questions in the Q&A. And as you see, we're getting to them as we're going through this. So, Rick, I believe we're going to turn it over to Mark to talk about a few things.
Yes. Mark, would you like to go ahead and start about your harmonization, US versus the EU?
Well, I heard a lot. I think a lot of what Yvonne and Susanna covered a lot of what I would have to say about that. Although I do have to question Susanna. You mean in Ireland? My wife's the first descendant from Ireland. I have never figured that she spoke English at all. Unless three is a tree, I can't understand what those two cross. Regardless to say, yeah. So discussion about harmonization between standards in the U.S. and the EU. It's real easy to get wrapped up in my industry is the only industry that exists, and there are a lot of different industries out there. Some of those industries do have harmonization between the US and the EU, medical devices being one of those, probably the biggest one of them. And that's, I would say, and Yvonne would know better than me, but it's probably been going on for well better than a decade. That was a position where UL adopted EU standards on medical devices, and UL was the piece of the United States that oversaw that standards development. And so when that happened, it made things easy. In a lot of different industries, that's just not the case. Many industries, there is no harmonization that goes between the two. Now, general overall directives may be so, but actual harmonization of standards that a product would be tested to and or certified to would be quite different. And so you have to look at those and see what those are. Even in a position of that, the new kind of blocker that's involved in that now was if we rewound 10 years ago, IEC standards for most industries were at least harmonized and standardized inside of the EU and or Europe at that time, including the UK as well. However, there's been a new piece that's fallen into that called in-country clauses. So now with inside of standards, there's a piece there that says, yes, you comply to the standard. However, inside our country, we require this to be run, or we don't require this, or this is different, or that's different. Those are very difficult to navigate, and I would suggest you get a hold of somebody recommended earlier that their testing laboratory, UL, was able to do that. ETL does a wonderful job of that. There are all kinds of Yvonne, that's her business for several industries. They can help you navigate these waters. But just to think, because I have a UL label or even certification to EU standards via CE mark, that's not even a self-certification, but one where you've actually had a lab test for you and certify that you meet that criteria. Understand may work in Italy, but may not work in France. But that's purely industry specific. I'm not going to say that's an overbroad reaching position. I work a lot in electronics, and with electronics, it varies from one to the other. You just really don't know what kind of a silk screen or a smoke screen you're going to get thrown up there. That's all I'm going to say about harmonization. I'll go on. I think the next slide is going to talk a little bit about the difference between what happens on conformity assessment in the US versus the EU. In general, in the US, we don't have anything that would relate to self-certification. Everything in the US has to go through a National Registered Testing Lab or a NRDL. It has to be third-party tested, and that third-party testing then becomes open to codes, regulations, things of that nature, where that kind of thing is dictated. The EU is quite different, although they have started adopting some third-party conformity assessment for years. As far back as I can remember, 40 years, they've been very strong on self-certification. I think a big reason of this, and this is certainly just my opinion, is there's a lot of difference between the laws in the EU and the US. A company can be held more accountable, I might say, in the EU than they can in the US. So there's a big difference there in how the laws play out and all that works. But so I go out and I get a UL label in the US tested to a UL standard. Does that just mean that I can jump over into Europe and go crazy? Absolutely not. There's going to be all kinds of changes to that, the ways that happen. Vice versa, you bring even an EU certification, even to a US standard into the United States. If that's not one of those National Registered Testing Laboratories that did that testing for you, then it has absolutely no weight whatsoever. And so the countries are very protective of those positions and stand by that. With that, and I know we're running short on time, I'll go over to the third piece, which has been tested on several times, and that is, do all standards follow the same governance? Is there some type of World Trade Organization position or overarching governance that oversees all standards? And the answer to that is absolutely not. Standards development organizations, regardless of where they're at in the world, tend to build their own governance and how their own governance works. In the United States, we tend to float back, which is the same thing that's done in the EU, tends to float back to one body that may oversee a large part of that. However, understand that even though those two entities now are involved in the governance, one set of governance between, per se, the SDO and the governance of an overarching entity, such as a Sinelec or a ANTS or something of that nature, may have differences or different interpretations in their governance that doesn't necessarily fit through. So just to say, you could say, well, I have this, and so this is okay. You could certainly have another agency argue with them that that does not fall underneath their governance. Does there need to be harmonization there? No ands, ifs, or buts. Unfortunately, I don't see any quick future to that solving itself. Matter of fact, I believe it's going in the opposite direction. The WTO has made a position to put a position out on standards, that all standards will follow the international standards, but that has now created quite a large war as to what does it qualify for you to be considered an international standard. And to the best of my knowledge, as of today, the only standards, and again, industries vary from one to the other. If you look at accounting standards, there's 3 different accounting standards that are practiced in the world. They don't cross with each other. All 3 are accepted by the WTO. The other side of that, when you start falling down into electronics, home equipment, things of that nature, the international standard is considered the IEC, which really, in a lot of respects, I can agree, is the only true international standard. However, they are very heavily weighted and biased by the European community. Um, I think eventually we will, not to my beliefs, and this are not to my feelings that it's the right thing to do, but I think eventually you'll see these break into three pieces. I think you'll see Americans' position on this, Europeans' position, and then the Asian position as well. That's unfortunate, but I think we're headed in a very rapid road to get to exactly that position as to where that's going to be. I'm willing to answer any questions you have. And like I said, with this group, they've already answered a lot of those questions. I appreciate your time today, but even being part of this group, I feel like being part of this group, my IQ went up about 4 points just by being around them. So with that said, Jonathan, Rick, I'll turn it back over to you guys.
Thank you, Mark. And go ahead, Rick. Please answer or ask the question.
Yeah, I just have a small comment. I know personally, our company that I represent, they also had to do IECEx system and for some explosive proof products. I think people that if you ever have to do that, that's on this call, it's going to cost you. And you've got to have enough units potentially to be sold to justify the cost on all this. And I know I talked with Yvonne about this earlier too. It's you can't just pay $20,000 or $30,000 or $40,000, $50,000 and sell a $5 item. You're gonna have to sell a lot of those items. But the point is I'm trying to make is that, so what I understand is that this is the certified equipment scheme is in Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore, except the IECEx. But I think we want to do a takeaway from here with even some of the audience is that what are some of these things that we want to see maybe policy changed? Because we all know that we have to pay for these things, but we want to see what can we try to do to get this harmonization. Harmonization is a big word for 2 or 3 different things, but the point is we need to get as much harmonized between the US and the EU so that SMEs do not have to pay these. And I think this is something that we need to explore in our trade policy that can be brought up by different members. And if you would like to send that to us via email, we would love to hear from you. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Rick. And for everybody in the chat is a SurveyMonkey where you can actually fill out that survey if you click on that link. Please let us know, what, to Rick's point, how can we best serve everybody? And also the other thing we want to know in the survey is, we just did a very high level, real quick. I mean, hours going by just super fast with these experts. But, if you want to go more in depth with your assessment of your conformity, if you want to go more in depth than GDPR, please let us know on that SurveyMonkey, because, if there is a need from you attendees to go more in depth on these 3 topics, we would love to focus on each one of those individually. And one topic that we really didn't even get to talk about was currency changes with the EU. A lot of people just assume that all European Union countries take the euro. I can tell you that Hungary takes the forint, which is their local currency. Poland takes the zloty. Romania takes the lei. Sweden still has their own currency. Czech Republic, Bulgaria. So just because you want to do business in the EU doesn't always mean that the currency is going to be in euros. So that may be something that you may say, hey, we would like to really focus on that as well. If you could do a webinar just on the different currencies and what it's going to take for an SME or, the right kind of bank that I need to handle multiple currencies. Because I can tell you from an SME's perspective, and when I'm talking about SME, I'm almost a micro exporter because I'm 40 employees. So 40 employees selling to 28 countries, we still consider a small business exporter, but it's almost micro compared to companies that have 100, 150 employees. So, for people like me, having the right bank helps us with all those currencies and those transactions and everything like that. And also having people like Yvonne, having people like Mark, having people like Susanna that we can use as resources for an SME of my size or even larger or even smaller is great, because you're going to get exactly what's going on, and you're going to know whether it's positive or negative, their history on whether it's GDPR, whether it's on conformity assessments, whether it's on regulations and currency and everything else. So I think it's very important for all of you attendees to please fill out that survey so we know, A, did you like the webinar? B, what would you like to know more about? Because we just did a very, very high level on this. But I want to thank all the speakers and the panelists. Have one more, looks like we may have another question. We will have this recorded for all of you. We also will talk to the speakers about possibly sharing the presentation if they're okay with it. We'll talk to the speakers. We'll get back to you on that. And there will be a link that goes out to everybody to where you can find this on our social media channels. But I want to thank all the panelists, all the speakers, and the attendees for your time. And Rick, I'll turn it back over to you and everybody else.
Thank you. There's one other thing that I just want to give a teaser for some of our audience here. We could also talk in the future about some other items, such as provide the US SMEs IP one patent policy for all EU countries.
Mhm.
I'm just going to throw out some of these. Should we increase the de minimis value? That people that try to ship a few small items, there's a tremendous tax that you have to pay on the de minimis if there is none. And by the way, when I was in the UK recently, they did away with theirs. So there's no de minimis. That means you pay, even if it's a $10 coming in, you have to pay the tax on that. So what's the right number? Is it $1,000, $2,000? These are something that you might want to think about, that we're just trying to get your interest in something for the future. We could also, would you want to talk about financial assistance for IPR litigation, for grievances before the ITC or the WTO? That's a great conversation that you might be interested in, for enforcement costs related to the IPR litigation for patents and trademarks. So we also have high tariffs on US food and ag products. That's a topic that maybe some of you, or some of your friends that are into that type of sector. We can't cover all sectors today, but I just want you to know that we're looking at everything, and we would love to hear from you on that. But thank you all for coming. And I guess, Jonathan, we'll go ahead and close it up.
Thank you, everybody. Please be looking for the recording. Please get back to us. Thank you, speakers, for your great time and information. You have our contact information there, everybody. And look forward to the next webinar. Thank you all. Wish you all a great evening.
Thank you.